is submitted to no limits, no constraints. On the other hand, I would like to tell you that the other countries, especially intermediate powers like Canada, are not powerless. They have the capacity to build a new order that encompasses our values, such as respect for human rights, sustainable development, solidarity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the various states. The power of the less power starts with honesty.
It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. So what are our options? In 1978, the Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window: "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down. For decades, countries like Canada prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. We joined its institutions, we praised its principles, we benefited from its predictability. And because of that, we could pursue values-based foreign policies under its protection. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals, and we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, The architecture, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself. But let's be clear-eyed about where this leads. A world of fortresses will be poorer, more fragile, and less sustainable. And there's another truth. If great powers abandon even the pretense of rules and values for the unhindered pursuit of their power and interests, the gains from transactionalism will become harder to replicate. Hegemons cannot continually monetize their relationships. Allies will diversify to hedge against uncertainty. They'll buy insurance, increase options in order to rebuild sovereignty. Sovereignty that was once grounded in rules but will increasingly be anchored in the ability to withstand pressure. This room knows this is classic risk management. Risk management comes at a price. But that cost of strategic autonomy, of sovereignty, can also be shared. Collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortresses. Shared standards reduce fragmentations. Complementarities are positive sum. And the question for middle powers like Canada is not whether to adapt to the new reality. We must. The question is whether we adapt by simply building higher walls or whether we can do something more ambitious. Now, Canada was amongst the first to hear the wake-up call, leading us to fundamentally shift our strategic posture. Canadians know that our old, comfortable assumptions that our geography and alliance memberships automatically conferred prosperity and security, that assumption is no longer valid. And our new approach rests on what Alexander Stubb, the President of Finland, has termed value-based realism. Or to put another way, we aim to be both principled and pragmatic. Principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter, and respect for human rights. And pragmatic in recognizing that progress is often incremental, that interests diverge, that not every partner will share all of our values. So we're engaging broadly, strategically with open eyes. We actively take on the world as it is, not wait around for a world we wish to be. We are calibrating our relationships so their depth reflects our values. And we're prioritizing broad engagement to maximize our influence, given the fluidity of the world at the moment, the risks that this poses, and the stakes for what comes next. And we are no longer just relying on the strength of our values, but also the value of our strength. We are building that strength at home. Since my government took office, we have cut taxes on incomes, on capital gains, and business investment. We have removed all federal barriers to interprovincial trade. We are fast-tracking $1 trillion of investments in energy, AI, critical minerals, new trade corridors, and beyond. We're doubling our defense spending by the end of this decade, and we're doing so in ways that build our domestic industries. And we are rapidly diversifying abroad. We've agreed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the EU, including joining SAFE, the European Defence Procurement Arrangements. We have signed 12 other trade and security deals on 4 continents in 6 months. In the past few days, we've concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar. We're negotiating free trade pacts with India, ASEAN, Thailand, Philippines, and Mercosur. We're doing something else. To help solve global problems, we're pursuing variable geometry. In other words, different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests. So on Ukraine, we're a core member of the Coalition of the Willing and one of the largest per capita contributors to its defense and security. On Arctic sovereignty, We stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering. So we're working with our NATO allies, including the Nordic-Baltic Gate, to further secure the alliance's northern and western flanks, including through Canada's unprecedented investments in over-the-horizon radar, in submarines, in aircraft, and boots on the ground, boots on the ice. Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland and calls for focused talks to achieve our shared objectives of security and prosperity in the Arctic. On plurilateral trade, we're championing efforts to build a bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union, which would create a new trading bloc of 1.5 billion people. On critical minerals, we're forming buyers' clubs anchored in the G7 so that the world can diversify away from concentrated supply. And on AI, we're cooperating with like-minded democracies to ensure that we won't ultimately be forced to choose between hegemons and hyperscalers. This is not naive multilateralism, nor is it relying on their institutions. It's building coalitions that work, issues by issue, with partners who share enough common ground to act together. In some cases, this will be the vast majority of nations. What it's doing is creating a dense web of connections across trade, investment, culture, on which we can draw for future challenges and opportunities. Argue the middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together. Which brings me back to Havel. What does it mean for middle powers to live the truth? Well, first, it means naming reality. Stop invoking rules-based international order as though it still functions as advertised. Call it what it is: a system of intensifying great power rivalry where the most powerful pursue their interests using economic integration as coercion. It means acting consistently, applying the same standards to allies and rivals. When middle powers criticize economic intimidation from one direction but stay silent when it comes from another, we are keeping the sign in the window. It means building what we claim to believe in. Rather than waiting for the old order to be restored, it means creating institutions and agreements that function as described. And it means reducing the leverage that enables coercion. That's building a strong domestic economy. It should be every government's immediate priority. And diversification internationally is not just economic prudence, it's a material foundation for honest foreign policy, because countries earn the right to principled stands by reducing their vulnerability to retaliation. So Canada. Canada has what the world wants. We are an energy superpower. We hold vast reserves of critical minerals. We have the most educated population in the world. Our pension funds are amongst the world's largest and most sophisticated investors. In other words, we have capital, talent. We also have a government with immense fiscal capacity to act decisively. And we have the values to which many others aspire. Canada is a pluralistic society that works. Our public square is loud, diverse, and free. Canadians remain committed to sustainability. We are a stable and reliable partner in a world that is anything but. A partner that builds and values relationships for the long term. And we have something else. We have a recognition of what's happening and a determination to act accordingly. We understand that this rupture calls for more than adaptation. It calls for honesty about the world as it is. We are taking the sign out of the window. We know the old order is not coming back. We shouldn't mourn it. Nostalgia is not a strategy. But we believe that from the fracture, we can build something bigger, better, stronger, more just. This is the task of the middle powers. The countries that have the most to lose from a world of fortresses and the most to gain from genuine cooperation. The powerful have their power. But we have something too. The capacity to stop pretending, to name reality, to build our strength at home, and to act together. That is Canada's path. We choose it openly and confidently, and it is a path wide open to any country willing to take it with us. Thank you very much.
President Trump's remarks in Davos, Switzerland this week forced Western leaders to reevaluate their relationship with the U.S. That's as tensions escalated here at home over the ongoing immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota. For more, we turn tonight to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart of MS Now. Good evening, gentlemen.
Hi, Jeff. Good evening.
So, David, what did we learn this week from President Trump's climb down on acquiring Greenland, about his instincts, his sense of leverage, and the limits of his approach?
Well, he does have a method that he uses over and over again, which is to overreach, to offend everybody, and then back off. And he sort of did that. And that would be the benign explanation of what happened this week. The serious explanation is that this, I think, was probably the final break in the post-war international order. That we've taken it for granted, that we in the West, as we call it, are democracies aligned and friends with each other. And what really struck me with this week was how many European leaders, Mark Carney from Canada, how much pleasure they took in being bitterly breaking, divorcing with America, and that we're never going back to that. And I asked Europeans, like, is it like that Taylor Swift song, We Are Never Getting Back Together? And they said, yes, that's what it's like. We are never getting back together, because they say, you might elect a sane person in 2028, but you're always 4 years away from another one of these. And so they are really rethinking the whole global architecture. And it should be concerning to Americans, as Robert Kagan wrote in The Atlantic this week. We're going to look back on the Cold War with nostalgia, and we're going to look back on the post-Cold War world as if it was paradise. And that we're just entering, as Kagan wrote, the most dangerous time in American foreign policy since World War II.
Jonathan, should allies take some reassurance from the outcome that Trump ultimately backed off his tariffs and territorial demands, or concern about the way that it started?
I think the allies, particularly with Greenland, they understood what was happening, and I think, to David's point, this was the break. Going after Greenland, territory of Denmark, NATO ally. The president of the United States was willing to blow up NATO in order to get Greenland. And I watched the speech he gave at Davos with just my jaw on the ground for how many norm-busting things he said. And I kept going back to David's point about the Europeans thinking we're like one election away from this happening again. When Vice President Kamala Harris went to the Munich Security Summit, the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, she gave a speech. She sat down with the outgoing president, who asked, President Biden says America is back. But the question is, for how long? Europeans have been wary of the United States since the first term of Donald Trump. And I think the speech by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, to me, was the rhetorical break. Because what I heard from him in style and language was all the things we're used to hearing from an American president, setting the table for what it means to be a global collective unit that is about as much about security as it is about mutual prosperity. And it was the Canadian Prime Minister who stood up for that, only to be threatened the next day by the President of the United States for saying those exact words.
You mentioned Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister. Here he is in his own words.
Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. The middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together.
A rupture, he says. And David, if governing by strength and spectacle is a defining feature of the Trump era, how sustainable is that approach for allies who are trying to manage this relationship for the next 3 years?
Yeah, well, it's governing by pure rancor. And, you know, Donald Trump has set out to create a world where gangsters can have free reign, and that the people who believe in the use of force above the rule of law, they should be able to run the show. And what's perverse about it is that he seems to have gone back to some sphere of influence idea from the 19th century, giving Russia that region, giving China that region, as long as we get to control our region. And this is simply, it's just an illusion to think you can take this approach and it won't lead to bloodshed. We've already seen since 2013, I think I mentioned this in the show some weeks before, that the number of people who died in war deaths from 1990 to 2013 was like 15,000 a year. After 2013, it surges to over 100,000 people a year. So we're always seeing a massive ramp up in bloodshed. And then when you get to where it's gangster versus gangster, we can expect that to continue or to exacerbate.
Well, while at Davos, the president launched what he's calling the Board of Peace, and the board's official mandate was to help oversee the Gaza Strip under an Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal brokered by the Trump administration last year, though the president has hinted at broader ambitions here. It's not exactly clear how this will all operate. And Jonathan, some allies worry that this board could undermine the UN. But could the opposite be true? Could this board, could the reason the board exists, could that be because the UN has struggled to adapt to modern conflicts and geopolitical realities?
I mean, maybe. Sure, a board of peace on paper sounds great. But who's on this board? And who created it? And who is going to be the person who can be the president of this board of peace long after he's no longer president of the United States? Donald Trump. You were just showing a moment ago, I believe it was the family photo of the people who were there on the board of peace. There's no France, there's no United Kingdom, there's no Western alliance. It's all potentates from the Middle East and Viktor Orban and other people who don't exactly care really about small d democracy and you know, liberal small d democratic values. So forgive me if I am not, you know, jumping for joy over the Board of Peace and what they're going to do for Gaza or do to Gaza.
How do you see it? I mean, are we in this moment where you have these sort of ad hoc coalitions replacing permanent institutions like the UN?
It could be. I mean, I'm one who believes that the Trump administration, going back to the Abraham Accords in the first term, was superior in regards to the Middle East than the Biden administration or the Obama administration's policies. And so I think they've done some good things in the Middle East. And if they can pour investments into Gaza, God bless them. I'm a little dubious they can do so with Hamas running Gaza and unwilling to step down. Who's going to want to invest? And so it is still a fact that you can call an international confab, but unless you actually prefer democracy and a place that will be stable, I'm very dubious that it's going to work.
Let's shift our focus stateside with what's happening in Minneapolis with the ICE enforcement. As we speak, there are thousands of people in the streets of Minneapolis protesting. We learned this week about an internal ICE memo that allows agents to enter people's homes without a judicial warrant. They're using administrative warrants. At what point does this aggressive enforcement start to undermine constitutional guardrails, Jonathan?
Start to? One could argue that it's already happening. that you have ICE, busting into people's homes, snatching people off the streets, or as folks in Minneapolis are saying, people are being kidnapped, cars left in the middle of the road, sometimes still running with the possessions inside because ICE has snatched people off the street. I mean, what is happening in Minneapolis and Minnesota? It breaks my heart, because we are seeing these constitutional norms that you're asking about being eroded before our very eyes, being not just challenged, but abused. That's the word I'm looking for, abused. When you look at a 5-year-old who and his father, who are in process, the asylum-seeking process, which means they are not undocumented, being used as bait, and then shipped to Texas with his father. Or Mr. Tao, the 57-year-old, who earlier in the week was hauled out of his home in boxer shorts and Crocs and a robe in 12-degree temperatures. I mean, what is happening to the people of Minneapolis, to American citizens? There was just a report today of a U.S. Army vet who was taken into custody for 8 hours there in Minneapolis. At some point, well, I was going to say the administration will have to see the error of its ways, but they will not. And this gets to the thing where I say my heart's broken, but my heart is full. Watching the protests in Minneapolis of people taking to the streets to stand up for their own constitutional rights, but to stand up for their communities and for their fellow folks who live in Minneapolis, because people should not have to live in fear the way that they're living there in Minneapolis right now. It's just at a moral level. How can anyone look at what's happening in Minneapolis and not stand up and not fight back and not push back? Because if it's happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a state that's 75% white, it's coming to you next, and it's already happening in Maine.
David, how does all of this strike you?
Yeah, the domestic analog of the foreign policy. It's a theory that we should rule by force. And I think what we've seen is a disillusion of the ideals of what democracy is supposed to be all about. And one of the things I'm curious about is how will the American people react? How are they reacting to the image of the 5-year-old kid, Liam? And I think that we already know from polling that large majorities do not approve of what's going on. They think ICE is overbearing, cruel, and ruthless. But how much will they react? Will it cause a break in public opinion of the sort we haven't seen since the first Trump term? Maybe. You have to remember, I remember when I first started the conservative movement, there was a strong libertarian presence. And the single greatest thing they were talking about over and over again was federal troops violating due process rights, First Amendment rights, Bill of Rights. And this is exactly what's happening under the Republican Party. So there still is a libertarian element within the Republican Party. Are they going to say, what the heck? I did not sign up for this. And we'll see if that happens. But this is one of those issues, if there's ever going to be a break on the Trump coalition, I would think this would touch a chord.
David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, thanks to you both as always.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Hey, just a minute before you move on.